It's wonderful to see everyone here today. We have a program that I know you'll all be interested in. It's our great honor here at the SAIS Johns Hopkins Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies to be hosting one of the most prominent members of Congress on East Asian Pacific affairs. Representative Bera is currently the ranking member of the House of Representatives Subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific Affairs. If the Democrats take power, of course, in the midterms next year, he would be the chairman of that very important subcommittee. In addition to his role in those formal roles, he also plays strategic roles in a number of important caucuses. The Pacific Islands Caucus, he is co-chair. The Taiwan Caucus of the House of Representatives, he is co-chair. And then he's also chairs the Korea Working Group. So at this time when relations with East Asia are so complex and all sorts of cross pressures across the region, we have a congressional statesman, I think, is certainly one of the strong feelings I have from both previous discussions that we've had, who has served for 14 years with the U.S. Congress. Administrations come and go, but as many of us know, the senior members of Congress have a much longer perspective. And so now, with so much change going on in East Asia, we have someone who really does have those important long-term perspectives. And at the Reischauer Center, and we're now in our going into our 40th year, we've been the research center here at SAIS that has had a strong interest in Asia-Pacific issues, in which my own mentor, former ambassador to Japan, Edwin Reischauer, played a key role in our original establishment, and our center, of course, is named after him. We've been focusing on East Asia Pacific affairs, visiting scholars from the key nations of the region and other researchers. And so it gives us a particular honor to have Congressman Bera with us today. So let's welcome one of the foremost congressional statesmen on Asia Pacific in the U.S. Congress. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Well, I should stop right there when someone says so many nice things about you. It's going to go downhill from here. I thought I would keep my comments short so we can get into the conversation and take questions from the audience. But let me do some framing questions. I'll state the obvious first. The world is changing, and it's changing rapidly. If we think about the 75 years post-World War II, there was kind of a logical world order. And as an American, I think we can be proud of what that looked like, rebuilding Europe post-World War II, working with Japan, rebuilding Japan and watching Japan become a leading economic power in the world and one of our closest friends. War on the Korean Peninsula, but then, if you look at the Korean miracle, 40 years ago, one of the poorest countries in the world to where it is today, if you travel to Seoul, one of the most modern dynamic economies in the world. In the past 2 decades, though, you've seen some real disruptive events that have changed things. You saw the financial crisis of the world, which was a global event that caused disruption. You saw the pandemic, which was a global event that caused real disruption. And then for the first time in the post-World War II, post-Cold War era, you saw a big country war with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think those dynamics all come together when you think about what is U.S. foreign policy, what are the dynamics that are changing. You see in our own politics here in the United States, kind of a younger generation that's agitating for change. A lot of young people, if you look at the 2024 elections, but also where young people are, can I buy a house one day? Can we start a family? What does my future look like? Will we ever be able to retire? That's not a uniquely American conversation. When I'm in Japan and we talk to young people in Japan, it's the same exact conversation. There's a lot of angst, and you see that manifest in Japanese politics. That's the same conversation that takes place when I visit universities in Korea and talk to young people, the same challenges. You see gender dynamics playing out, right? You see, I think in America, the 21st century will be a feminine century because the number of women that, 60% of who gets graduate degrees, 65% are women. And I think you see that playing out in Asia as well. So the world is changing. What does that doctrine look like? What does the next 75 years look like? And I think that's what this decade will sort itself out. I'm sure we'll talk about that here. So a big part of my role in Congress is getting out there and traveling to places because you could sit in Washington, D.C. and have academic conversations, but it's incredibly important to talk to the people, to see, to understand, to talk to my peers in Japan, Korea, India, Australia, Europe, to really get a sense of how are they thinking about things. Because again, I think what's creating a little disquiet in the world is this America First doctrine. What does that mean? And how does that fit into things? So we should talk about that as well. And again, these are mostly my perspectives on things, but I think super important because, we're the old guys now. So, this next decade will be a decade of passing it on to the next generation of diplomats, of scholars, of the folks that are going to inherit and form the foundation for what the next 75 years looks like. And it will be a much more interconnected world. So, when people talk about America First here, whether it's on the far right or the far left, two big oceans do not protect America. The world is increasingly financially interconnected. Again, the pandemic demonstrated how easily from a global health security perspective, the world is interconnected. And then from just a food security and security in general, the world is interconnected. So it's a very vibrant, dynamic time. It is not a given what the next 75 years look like, and I think that falls to us that share similar values of democracy, of free markets, of opportunity, to work together, which is why the work I do with Japan and Korea and other Asian nations is so important at this moment in time, because it is not a given what those 75 years look like. But if we're intentional about this, our children and grandchildren should be able to enjoy the same peace and prosperity and opportunity that I grew up with. So that's what this is all about for me.
Welcome, Congressman Bera. It's really a delight to have you with us today. And I should say right at the very beginning, we really don't, of course, Congressman. Yeah, I think you're right. Congressman, you mentioned this too, that a discussion, of course, a few questions, a few points that we have to begin this, but then all of you, everybody here, we want to make this above all a chance for discussion. We'll have at least 30 minutes for discussion, and so please think of things that you might want to ask. We'll have roving mics to enable people to do that. But another thing that I should have mentioned at the beginning, many dimensions to Congressman Bera. Of course, he has a long congressional career, as we did say before, and you can see that he has traveled a lot. He's very, very interactive. He's also a medical doctor, one of the very few medical doctors in Congress. And he has a very broad conception of international relations and understands various aspects of human security, security in very, very broad and in many dimensions. But he's also a legislator who has some important and very interesting, I think, for all of us, legislation that's in progress right now. This is a bill, if I understand correctly, that's already passed the House Foreign Affairs Committee dealing with U.S. Japan-Korea cooperation. And a lot of us support that concept, but I wonder if you could tell us a little about, first of all, about what's in the bill and why you decided to do this.
Absolutely. So this is a bill that would create a trilateral dialogue and ongoing dialogue between legislators in the United States, Japan, and Korea. And some of it is, you mentioned, we have caucuses. So I'm co-chair of the U.S. Korea caucus. There's a U.S. Japan caucus, and we saw, so you have strong bilateral relationships. And if you go back a decade, the relationship between Korea and Japan was not a real good place. But it's truly important for the three of us to be working together. Because if you think about it, this is the third president that I've served under, but I've also, we've seen multiple presidents in Korea, we've seen multiple prime ministers in Japan. But I see a lot of the same parliamentarians that I saw 10 years ago. And I think it's incredibly important if we want long-lasting policy. Presidents will come and go, prime ministers will come and go, but many members of the General Assembly, the National Assembly, and the Diet are going to be there for a long time, and we have to create those priorities and policies. So then if we're talking on a regular basis in a trilateral way, we could say, here's policy that we think is really important. I can introduce it in Congress. My counterparts in Korea can introduce it in the National Assembly, and the counterparts in Japan could introduce it in the Diet. So I think, if I think about foreign policy doctrine, post-World War II, often it was the United States dictating to the rest of the world, here's what we should be doing. I don't think that is the 21st century doctrine. I think it's sitting with like-valued countries, having that dialogue, saying, okay, what makes sense to democratic countries, countries that share similar values, and then in each of our legislative bodies, introducing similar, that's how I would think about it. We started a Quad caucus because we think that is, that's the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. Again, we've talked a little bit about how do we do that at a legislative level as well. So we're not just all working independently, but we're working to create a foundational set of rules in each of our countries that share those values that then live on beyond.
Well, just thinking sort of conceptually about the way that the region is evolving, and I know you've talked about this in the past. In North Korea, of course, we have strengthening military capabilities, especially with the deepening relationship they seem to have with the Russians. The North Koreans sent troops to Kursk, and then the Russians are providing energy, technology, all sorts of things to them. And of course, that becomes challenging to South Korea and Japan, and their political trends, populism in both Korea and Japan, and uncertainties about what the other country might be doing. And then we've got this heritage of history originally too, a bitter history that's maybe gradually we're moving now 80 years since World War II, but of course there's a lot of memories there. So I guess your committee is going to, or your group is going to, on a systematic basis, one aspect of this is periodic meetings and maybe some staff support for this triangle. Is that right?
Yeah, the hope would be, if we're able to get this onto the House floor, vote on it to the Senate, get the legislation signed, is that we would actually put some resources behind this. So, maybe 1 year you'd have a trilateral dialogue in the United States, next year in Tokyo, next year in Seoul. So you would have this ongoing dialogue. We do see it in the transatlantic context, where you have a NATO parliamentarian alliance on a regular basis. Again, I'm biased, but I think the playing field that would set the stage for the 21st century is going to be the Indo-Pacific theater.
Well, in the that historic summit, the Camp David, President Yoon and President Biden and President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida, I guess they sort of began in this process.
They did, and that was part of what gave us momentum as well. Because again, you do see trilateral dialogues going on, and we want to keep the trilateral relationship at a strong place. And it does seem like even with the new administrations in Japan and Korea, the dialogue between the two countries has stayed in a good place. The Koreans, under President Yoon, I was there at his inauguration, are starting to look beyond the peninsula. I would say, when I first came to Congress, Korea, really was a bit insular, focused only on peninsular issues. I think that as their economy grows, they're building a defense industry, and they are starting to look beyond the peninsula. And again, obviously, you see some of the political dynamics and conversations taking place in Japan as they start to step up their defense spending. The Prime Minister had some, I don't think they were provocative statements, this past week, but I think Beijing saw them as, but I think that's a step in the right direction as well. And again, at the legislative level, we should continue working on this together. So I know in Korea and Japan, they're also, following the same thing. They've created, a dynamic as well where they could put some resources.
So then some of the issues beyond, of course, including some trust building in the triangle itself, but also through cooperation in the broader world that serves the broader purposes. For example, the two prime ministers have been going to NATO the last 2 or 3 years. And then, of course, development assistance. We unfortunately don't have, there's some aspects of our development assistance that have declined lately, of course. We don't have USAID in the sort of role that we historically did, and I know my father was with USAID, and so I certainly can sense that. Do you see this triangle, and of course the three countries would have to be aligned, but as one way of encouraging Japan and Korea and hopefully the United States to do more on development?
Yeah, so absolutely. I'll go back to my opening comments. Politics in all three countries, and it's not, you see it in Europe as well, are changing. Affordability is a real issue in all three of our countries. So there are going to be real domestic pressures that say, hey, we've got to focus on our own domestic populations. That's true in Japan, that's true in Korea, that's true in Europe, that's true in the United States. That doesn't mean we should abandon the world. So can we, Donald Trump would take this as a compliment. He's been incredibly disruptive to a lot of the political institutions here in the United States. When we rebuild those, when we rebuild a development, can we do it differently? Can we do it in partnership with friendly nations? One other piece of legislation we have that's bipartisan is the Mineral Security Partnership, which is all designed to say we recognize the risk of having a single source supply chain for rare earth elements and critical minerals, in this case, China. We need to diversify that relationship. We're not in competition. Can we work with a Korea and Japan to go into a Mongolia or go into Africa and develop these diverse supply chains? That's the genesis of the Mineral Security Partnership. The Biden administration enacted it. We want to codify that through legislation in Congress, which we've also introduced.
Well, hearing you talk about critical minerals, which of course is a great interest in, I think, all of these three countries, I just can't help thinking also of some developments we've seen even in the last 2 or 3 days as tensions between Japan and China seem to have risen. China seems to be using some of those economic weapons, including perhaps critical minerals and tourism and that sort of thing as leverage against Japan. And of course, the U.S. Japan alliance is important. I wonder how you see some of those recent tensions.
Absolutely. That's another piece of legislation that we've introduced and actually passed is to prepare for economic coercion, right? This is not the first time China has used economic coercion against Japan, choking off critical minerals and so forth, which Japan showed its resiliency in terms of developing some of those redundant supply chains. We saw when we placed THAAD batteries on the Korean Peninsula, Beijing used economic coercion and retaliation by choking off tourists. And now we're seeing it based on the comments of the Japanese Prime Minister saying, okay, we're not going to let Chinese travel to Japan. In the 21st century, that is not how you should resolve these issues, through bullying. That has been Beijing's nature to try to bully to get their way, which is why we think it is incredibly important, in a trilateral way, but also, we've seen economic coercion used against Australia when they were talking about COVID origins. Again, we should resolve our differences through dialogue, through diplomacy, not through bullying. I don't think that's going to change at this point, because we've seen it here in the United States as well, because of President Trump's trade and tariff talks, creating, Beijing deciding to create a choke point on rare earths coming to the United States. I think we have to work together to, again, build resiliency to that economic coercion. And that is part of what our legislation really asks the administration to do, the executive branch, to look at what tools we have in the toolbox. And it's not just, when a country like Lithuania decides to have diplomatic relations with the people in Taiwan, again, China retaliated. And we're big countries, the United States, Japan, Korea, with resilient economies. We can sustain that. But it's when they look at the Pacific Islands, or they look at, a country like Lithuania, that we should also then say, hey, can we step in there to help them weather some of the economic turbulence that might be created by these decisions?
You mentioned the Pacific Islands, and I do recall that you had been down, even in Tuvalu, if I recall, 12,000 people. Takes you, 20 hours or so to get down there. But you've been to a number of these strategic islands. I don't know how else to think of them, given the resources that they have underneath the sea, given the ways that robotics and AI and so on are allowing us to exploit or to find out what's down there much more than was true. We do need to do something about the Pacific Islands, don't we? And could your trilateral concept actually apply also to support for the Pacific Islands?
We really do. So in the last Congress, visited Fiji, Tonga, and Tuvalu, and then on a separate trip, visited the Solomon Islands and PNG as well, Papua New Guinea. Incredibly important playing field, because when you think about the Pacific Islands together, just the massive economic zone that they cover, the fisheries, they're on the front line of climate change as well. And this is a place where, you mentioned Tuvalu, where the United States and Japan and others, in terms of connecting that island, laying cable, that's something that we did together. It's things like that we should be working together. Now, the Trump administration policy has been a bit of a retreat, which is a mistake. But in our conversations with Australians and New Zealand, Japan, while we're sorting this out, we should work together. And they may not be able to fill the void left by dismantling of USAID, et cetera. And we're not talking about big investments because these are, while a large area of economic zones, the populations are not huge. But the challenges are, because they're somewhat isolated. I also, when I think about aid and development, if we can solve issues of healthcare on the Solomon Islands or remote islands, that helps us address healthcare issues in our own rural communities as well. So it becomes a testing ground to do things together.
Can you imagine energy too? Thinking about that, solar power or renewables. Generally those islands don't have a lot of energy.
Yeah, and again, Tuvalu's we're probably the only members of Congress that have ever been there, but it is on the front line of sea level rise. This is an island that may not exist in our children's lifetime. And then, so if we can address sea level rise there, it's an issue on the coast of Japan, it's an issue on the coast of the United States, it's an issue on the Korean Peninsula. So this becomes a place where if we can solve some of, or at least address some of these issues, they can help us.
My wife and I were down in several of these places a few months ago, and one thing that was really striking, well, actually, in part with many introductions from JICA, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, and they have a presence in, virtually all of those small islands, and the Koreans have presence in several of them also. Even though with USAID, there's where I think the cutbacks in things like USAID actually do hurt. The presence wasn't very large, but it was strategic, given, that was the only real presence of the U.S. in these countries in many cases.
Yeah, and that clearly was a change, because you heard under the Biden administration, a little bit under the Obama administration, the Republicans really beating on Democrats, saying you're not doing enough in the Pacific Islands, which is why it's shocking to me that there's so much silence as USAID was dismantled, as our diplomatic missions on these islands, which we are just starting to rebuild. Again, I think we, the United States, post the Cold War, took our eye off the ball and felt, okay, well, the world order's decided. We should be building up those missions. In the interim, and we should be building up those missions with our allies, with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, looking at ways for us to partner together. Because again, on the islands, I don't think our goals are very, very different. I think we want to maintain influence. We want to maintain maritime security, freedom of navigation throughout this. Because if adversarial nations gain a foothold on these islands, put naval bases on these islands, it is a threat to the United States, but it's an existential threat to New Zealand and Australia, and it puts them much closer to places. So when you're talking about you're seeing it, I guess the example I would use is, I did criticize the Obama administration being too slow in the South China Sea, that we should have put a stop to that immediately, because now it's a much more complicated challenge that Beijing's built up these islands, and there's been a militarization of the South China Sea. That becomes a much more dangerous scenario.
Another thing that was very, very striking to us, I guess, like in Tonga, for example, was one of them. 200,000 people, a huge Chinese embassy. The Chinese embassy was by far the largest major building.
We have a fourth floor embassy there.
Yeah.
Where we could see the Chinese embassy, that was really large.
Well, you remember that, how
I do.
And it's common, isn't it, across the South Pacific?
It is. So China does have these huge embassies. They have huge diplomatic missions. But at the end of the day, if you talk to the people, I'll use the Solomon Islands as an example. In their elections, when they're voting with the West. They're voting with Japan. They're voting to have stronger ties with the United States. It's when they're forming their government. Now, our values are we can't drop bags of cash off with, as they're forming it. Unfortunately, some of our adversarial nations are able to do that. And then when they form government, it's not necessarily reflective of the people, which is why we have to be there. One of the things that I think we will realize a decade from now is by not funding some of the democracy programs that we historically have funded through USAID and other programs, that leaves a void.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a void, and then it gets filled by others. And when that's in small nations that have a broader strategic value, then that becomes a real challenge.
I mean, the shuttering of Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, like that is leaving a huge void. That was a way to get information to the people on these islands or in remote parts of the world. We don't have that tool right now. I hope we remedy that fairly quickly, but that is a real challenge.
Now, of course, many of these things take legislation, they take congressional action. And recently, we're lucky now, of course, the government's operating again. I wonder what we should take. I mean, maybe looking particularly to the future about shutdowns and how to avoid the sort of things that we've gone through.
Nobody ever wins a shutdown. Democrats don't win, Republicans don't win. It is a horrible way to get policy done. You never get policy victories out of a shutdown. It's the American people that lose, and it sends the wrong message to the rest of the world. Again, the hallmark of the United States of America was reliability and predictability. We're at an inflection point where that is creating uncertainty, and that's not a good thing. We have to get through this. I do think one of the, if you look at the shutdown and you look at the elections that took place a few weeks ago, I think it was a real shock to the Republican Party. And if there's a net positive coming out of this, I am seeing Republican senators starting to find their voice. What's been shocking to me that is different from Trump's first term is in the first term, I ran into Paul Ryan recently, and I mentioned to him that, I would normally say, I miss you, Paul. But I do, and Mitch McConnell, because they recognized Congress was a different branch of government. And what's been shocking in the first 10 months of this Republican-led Congress is they've just rolled over and abdicated their responsibilities to the president. I think it is a good thing that we're starting to see Republican senators push back a little bit. I'm not seeing it in my House colleagues or with Speaker Johnson yet, but at least if the Republican senators every senator thinks they'll be president one day, so they don't take their orders from anyone, but I think they are starting to push back a little bit, and that's a good thing, because we need Congress to be a separate branch of government, not one dictated by the executive branch.
Well, Ambassador Foley that I work for always stressed that really the people's house, of course, is the House of Representatives.
Well, we're closest to the citizens.
It's closer to the citizens, yes. Well, as you can see, we have quite a few students here. And of course, we're a school of international relations. And many of them are interested in public policy. I can see even some of my own students from the past who've been hoping, and several of them actually were scheduled to go into public service. And whether that it will be that specific angle or whether it might be the Capitol Hill. I know there's an awfully lot who are very interested in Capitol Hill as well. And but mostly they're not quite through. They're just looking to the future. And I wonder what advice you would give students who are interested in a future in public policy.
I would say go for it. I mean, I think it is incredibly important at this moment in time. I touched on it in my opening comments that there was a world order post-World War II through the Cold War into the post-Cold War era, and I think it served our planet very well. Much of that was put in place by the United States. The next 75 years, what that world order looks like isn't a given. We have a lot of multilateral institutions that were reflective of the last 75 years. How do we modernize the United Nations? Because if we were designing the United Nations today, it would be very different. I do a lot in the global health security space. What is a modern global health security arrangement? A WHO, World Bank, World Trade Organization. There's an infinite number of things that we need to do in terms of modernizing a rapidly changing world. What is going to be the impact of AI? I'm a believer that we're having trouble writing our own AI legislation here in Congress, but if we were super functional, this would be another place where we should be working with Japan, with Korea, with Europe, so we don't all have different sets of rules, that we actually put the guardrails up in unison. That's the world that I hope for. That's the world that where countries that share similar values. But I'm an old guy now, right? I'm 60 years old. I'm not going to do this for the next 20 years. It's going to be the world that all of you inherit, which is why I think it is going to be so important for young people to be internationally engaged based on a common set of values, because you're going to see the world very differently than the world I grew up in.
Of course, we do. I hope everyone's thinking about things that they might like to ask. And as you can appreciate, Congressman Bera really is thoughtful and responsive. And we do have a bit of time. There's only one question. My apologies for this. There really is. You talked about global health security just now. And this is Johns Hopkins University. And we have not only SAIS, I think we have some people from public health and other places. And one of our proudest recent achievements at Reischauer Center during the pandemic, we did something on Asia and COVID. And that was about that particular pandemic. But one strong appreciation was that, given the sort of the environment that existed in Asia, rapid industrialization encroaching on, areas where animals and humans have coexisted for all of this time anyway. The particular environment that Asia has, with large numbers of people and that kind of dynamic growth, it's not surprising that there'll be pandemics being generated. And I guess my question, maybe relating to your overall theme, is what about future pandemics? What about possible ways that Japan, Korea, and the United States might cooperate? Or how should we think of that problem of cooperation on global health security?
We should all be working together. If nothing else, the pandemic demonstrated that viruses don't know borders, and a pandemic is going to travel very quickly across the world just because of how interconnected we are. We should be working on financial policy as well, because we saw in the Great Recession how things are not isolated in the 21st century. So we should be working together to say, how do we do better disease surveillance? How do we work together? I'm a doctor. I thought it was remarkable that we came up with a vaccine that was safe and effective within 12 months. Can we get that down to 100 days? Can we get that down to 30 days? I think we can, but that's where our scientists should be working together. We're not in competition for this. We're, again, with like-valued allies, we should be solving these things. And I do think we should be working with China on global health security as well. What does this look like? I still have a lot of unanswered questions about COVID, though, because I would have expected Japan to get hit pretty hard, and because Tokyo is a very dense population, Prime Minister Abe took a very different approach, and it didn't. Now, was that some innate immunity to coronavirus? Because SARS and other viruses? Was it because there was a culture of masking that was already there, so it reduced spread? We don't know those answers, and we really should work together, our scientists, to try to figure out. I would have predicted India would have gotten hit really hard. Now it did with COVID variants in the second and third rounds, but those are things that we should be working to try to understand so we're better prepared, because we will have another pandemic, natural occurring, or I'm on the intelligence committee as well. You worry about biosecurity and man-made pathogens as well from adversaries.
Well, we've covered quite a range of subjects, and fortunately we have some time. And I know, in fact, he said so many times, Congressman Bera looks forward to hearing from people here and what you're thinking, but in particular, the kind of questions that you've got on any one of the range of issues, and
I'm sure
even others.
Having been a professor, and I used to be dean of admissions at University of California, Davis Medical School, students are not shy. So please do ask the questions.
Okay, I see a question over here.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bera.
Also, if people could identify themselves.
Okay, I'm Manav Sachdeva. I am the ambassador for food security for President Zelensky's office. Two questions. One is on Eurasian security. You touched upon U.S., Japan, and Korea relationship, given North Korea's engagement in providing every sort of problems for Ukraine from people. And how do you see that playing out? Is there a way in we weaponize this cooperation to help Ukraine in a way? And the second is there a bulwark of democracies in which you see India playing any role in that relationship vis-a-vis China as a strategic wall against that, or as my work has been also to try to get Prime Minister Modi and the government to align more with the United States on the policies in Ukraine? It's not been extremely successful, but I'd love your views on that, on those two things.
Sure, I'll start with, as we start to unpack the contours of what President Trump's proposing right now, I don't think this is a good deal for Ukraine. And I don't think, so that's my opinion, but I think it's probably shared by a lot of my colleagues. I'll start broadly. We, the United States, we have a transatlantic strategy. We have an Indo-Pacific strategy. I really do think we have to start tying transatlantic and Indo-Pacific strategies together, not by ourselves, but with, again, I think 21st century alliances are going to be ones based on values of democracy, of free markets, of opportunity, of human rights. So, what does that look like? How do we, I'm someone who supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the free trade deal between the United States, Canada, and the Asian nations. I would have hoped that we would have completed a transatlantic trade, which was TTIP, and then we would be marrying that together across. That obviously didn't happen. But in the geopolitical strategic lens, we should be doing that, because again, what happens in Europe isn't going to be isolated to Europe. It's going to impact Asia. It's going to impact North America. So I do think it matters to Asia how the crisis in Ukraine is resolved. What does that look like? What comes next? Was in India in September, and the U.S.-India relationship's not at a high water mark right now, but nothing's changed in terms of how Congress, Democrats and Republicans, and we recently introduced a resolution, codifying 3 decades of strategy going back to Bill Clinton of the importance of the U.S.-India relationship. Now, when I'm in India and talking to Indian diplomats, India wants to be seen as a major nation, at the table with all the big nations of the world. But in order to do that, you can't just be a non-aligned nation. And then India historically wants to maintain this non-alignment so they can play all sides. They understand that, their long-term security lies with the West. So my message to the Indians are, this is your opportunity. You have lines of communication with Russia, with Putin, that we don't. If you want to be at the big boy table, if you want to have that level of respect, you're going to have to step up and use that. Plus, that President Trump really does want to find an end to this conflict. The people in Ukraine are fatigued and tired. They're fighting valiantly for their freedom and their future, and they will continue doing that. I see the resolve in them. But is there a way to bring this to a conclusion in a way that the Ukrainian people have security guarantees? And India could play a role in that. The bigger question that I don't think we spend enough time talking about is, when this conflict ends, what do we do with Russia? Because we can't have Russia out as an isolated nation. It's not in the West's strategic interest for a stronger Russia-China alliance. Russia historically would be more aligned with Europe. And I think we have to actually start talking about, what does that look like? We can't forgive the sins of Putin and Russia either. So that is going to be a diplomatically challenging relationship. And again, I don't think we're spending enough time thinking about the what next, because we're dealing with the right now.
I can't help asking a related question briefly. You talk about the Atlantic and the Pacific and linking them more closely. Does that mean, for example, Japan and Korea, that we've been talking about, deepening their relationship with NATO, say, on things that don't have direct relation to geography, like, say, cybersecurity and that kind of thing?
Yeah, cybersecurity, AI, supply chain resiliency. If you think about demographic issues, the global north is aging, the global south has a youth bulge. What does that look like? That, it's not lost on me that is, that's the global south is where climate change is having the biggest impact. About a third of young people will, within the next 30 years, will be living on the continent of Africa. How do we work together to address that? Those are all things that, Europe, United States, Asia should all be working together on.
Some students I see, maybe right back there. Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Hello, good afternoon. Representative Bera, thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Dr. Calder and the Reischauer Center, for hosting such a wonderful event. I guess before I ask my question, I just wanted to say it's incredibly inspiring to see your work in institutionalizing the trilateral relationship in legislation. I think that is wonderful, and I should probably introduce myself as well. My name is Hyanu Ro from Sumitomo Corporation. I'm a policy analyst here, and it's a Japanese trading and investment company.
But
I'm also
from
a graduate
Korea
of SAIS.
originally.
Yeah, from Korea originally, but grew up in Japan as well. I guess if you look at the current landscape of trilateral cooperation and institutionalization, we see, let's say, the YTL summit. We see some government-to-government engagement. We see maybe with your bill, hopefully, if it passes, some legislative engagement. A big element that is actually missing is industry and private sector. So my question actually has to do with the role of the private sector in the trilateral relationship. So far, based off my just 1.5 years of experience from working, the trend is that the private sector naturally tends to follow the direction of the government, especially with Japan and South Korea. But we unfortunately haven't been able to see much trilateral engagement between the three countries and the three private sectors. But we do also see a big role of private sector in bilateral relations, such as the $550 billion investment from Japan to the United States, same with South Korea. And I guess my question is, what kind of role would you like us to play in advancing, let's say, your vision in the trilateral relationship?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because the private sector is often going to see itself in competition, right? So again, it would have been my hope that we'd pass something like TPP. In this case, maybe, yeah, I think multilateral trade deals are a good thing. The climate's not necessarily right in the United States to pursue that, nor in Japan or Korea. They're very difficult things, but I think it's still the right strategy. Short of that, are there critical areas where we should be working together, government and private sectors? So I mentioned one, supply chain resiliency, in rare earths and pharmaceuticals, APIs, and so forth. Because again, Korea, Japan, and now the United States have seen the vulnerability to single source supply chains. We saw it during the pandemic; it was very evident. But now we're seeing the risk of economic coercion, and that's dangerous because there's going to be strategic competition with China in the 21st century. The hope is to avoid kinetic confrontation, a kinetic war. Competition's fine, and we've seen how China uses economic leverage. So I do think that's an area that we should be working together, the private sector along with the government, public sector. Also on big, like again, I mentioned AI. What does that look like? What do the guardrails look like? Quantum computing, cybersecurity. Those are areas where each country has different strengths. We should work on that together with the private sector as well.
I see that we had some other questions there. Maybe one briefly right here. Okay.
Thank you so much. While, as you said, the strategic competition between U.S. and China will not go away, my concern as a Chinese American is how do we make sure that the Congress can take a leading role in ensuring protection of the Chinese American community and make sure that the tragic of Vincent Chin that happened because of the previous U.S.-Japan competition in the 80s does not happen to our community. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not just isolated to the Chinese American. I mean, I think harsh rhetoric against any ethnic group is, unfortunately, we're seeing that right now in the current administration. The value and strength of the United States is we're a nation of immigrants. My parents immigrated from India in the 1950s, but we're one generation after another. And I think that's what makes America this brilliant nation, different ethnicities, different cultures, different religions, different traditions, all woven together. Now, it makes this difficult as well because those tensions happen and, someone who travels, we're a pretty unique nation in terms of that diversity. If you're in Japan, if you're in China, if you're in Korea, you don't necessarily see that type of immigration, that type of diversity. I don't want us to lose that. I actually want us to fix immigration and welcome generations here because that is woven into our DNA of the founding of this nation and who we historically have been. That tension is playing out in America right now. And, you see it. I'm going to fight to continue to preserve who we are, a place that welcomes folks, that respects the rights and celebrates the diversity of who we are as a nation. Again, that tension is playing out in America right now in real time.
So I had another question along the aisle there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yajuan. I'm students here, so I'm doing research about AI in women's healthcare. I found it easy to publish an article in USA about this area, but it's a little bit sensitive and difficult to publish an article about AI in women's healthcare in China, especially with authors from USA. So my question is, do you think it's any possible for USA and China to cooperate in AI in women's healthcare? If yes, what's the entry point? Thank you.
Yeah, I would go back to, I think it's important for us to reestablish regular dialogue with China because the way you avoid war is you're actually talking to one another. You're looking for areas of common interest. Yes, we're going to be in competition around AI, but we should also be in cooperation around AI. One area that we've talked about traveling to China is around healthcare, right? We're not in competition with aging demographics. How do you manage chronic diseases? how do we work together to solve some of these issues? Those, to me, are common challenges of humanity. So around healthcare, that should be an area where we find the ability to work together and share information. Again, going back a decade, 2 decades ago, you did have academics going back and forth. And I would hope that we return to some level of cooperation in the future. I think it would be good for the young people in China to have that and have that opportunity, but it would certainly benefit us. And again, the goal here is to avoid, we'll be in competition, but avoid confrontation.
You said something very, to me at least, very interesting and important there. Of course, given the tensions between China and the United States, you think that healthcare potentially is a way to build some more stability or human level trust and so on?
I think healthcare is, I know some U.S. universities have established academic centers there, medical centers there, and I actually think that's a good thing. I think working together on common health challenges is a good thing. Again, the relationship's not at a great place right now, but I think it's important for us as members of Congress and others and the private sector to be going back and forth and looking at common challenges.
Thank you. Wow, we're getting lots of questions. Maybe right up straight ahead. You see please keep your hand up so we.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Alexander Taylor. I'm a first-year MAIR student. Earlier, you mentioned briefly history and the tensions that it can cause, as well as things like territorial disputes. And I'm wondering, obviously, depending on the administration in either country, things can fluctuate. And thankfully, relations between South Korea and Japan have been relatively good recently. But just the other day, we saw South Korea cancel maritime drills with Japan because one of the aircraft that was supposed to be involved had flown near what the Japanese called Takashima and what the Koreans called Dokdo. I'm wondering what role the U.S. can play, or more specifically, the U.S. legislature can play to help alleviate these pressures and tensions and sort of keep everybody on track. On common goals, especially in regards to, hopefully this trilateral legislation that you've put forward goes through. How do we maintain that alliance?
Yeah, so I think that's why it's so important to have an ongoing legislative dialogue, so it doesn't shift from one administration to the next administration, that you have long-term strategic planning. I also think, the U.S. can play a facilitative role, but I would separate historic issues, because clearly there are historic issues between Japan and Korea to the side, and then you have your geopolitical, strategic, economic, security issues. And yes, they do intertwine at times, but I would try to keep those separate. I think the administrations, both in recent administrations in Korea and Japan, have done a good job trying to keep the historic issues that have to be worked through with Japan and Korea, from the security, economic, strategic issues. And I think, we can help facilitate working through some of the historic issues, but that really is something that Japan and Korea have to work through and get to a place where the people of both countries are comfortable.
If I might, you mentioned long-term strategic planning. And then earlier, of course, in your legislation, you mentioned that you want to institutionalize some greater capabilities to deal with this triangle. I just wondered, are you talking about possibly some staff support, or are you or sort of scholarships or funds for conferences, or what do you see?
Yeah, so what I would see is, again, modeling it a little bit off of what we do in the transatlantic relationship, the NATO interparliamentarian dialogue, where you really could get a committed group of members of Congress, members of the Diet, members of the National Assembly that work on these issues long-term, build a relationship, introduce similar legislation in each of their legislative bodies after deliberation. and again, rotating. So it's not coming to Washington, D.C. every year. It's Washington, D.C. 1 year, Tokyo 1 year, Seoul 1 year. We do this in a bilateral way where I lead a delegation of members of Congress to Korea every year because we have a congressional study group on Korea. We have a congressional study group on Japan where my colleague Diana DeGette takes a different group of, and you just do one country for a week where you really get a deeper understanding. But we're not doing it in a trilateral way, and I think that would be the goal. And then put staff behind it, put resources behind it, so you are actually doing this. And again, my vision would be if let's say we have the Mineral Security Partnership, we're introducing that in Congress, they ought to be doing the same thing in Japan and Korea. But we ought to be talking about what that is so that we're all passing, critical legislation together.
That sounds like a great term, critical minerals partnership. Is that have you done any legislation?
We have actually. So
Oh.
we have. It's a bipartisan bill, not controversial. I think broadly supported. Is it in the NDA? Okay, working on getting it. But yeah, and it started under the Biden administration as well. So again, we think, it's great to do things at the executive level, but Congress is where you codify legislation, right, and create laws and create long-lasting structure.
Yeah, I would think. I mean, just thinking, say, about the Lobito project, President Biden was down there, and the Trump administration's had some interest in Lobito as well. That kind of thing, looking at those kind of issues.
Absolutely, right. And things like part of the reason for starting the Quad Caucus is I really do think the Quad, from a security, maritime security, freedom of navigation perspective, economic perspective, is incredibly foundational. So that's the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And again, there had been discussions, Korea being adjacent to some of that, and what does that look like? I don't think you'll see necessarily a NATO type alliance in Asia, but what are the alliances where like valued countries are all working together?
And then it gives some track one support for it by this being congressional legislative. Is that your idea?
Very much so, yes.
Interesting. Well, you can see you've got a huge group of questions. Maybe up fairly far up there, this lady right there.
Thank you so much. Katie Jo Youngkin's former State Department that was ripped over the summer. So thank you for opening it up to the public, for folks like us to stay engaged. How do we think about this cooperation in the ASEAN context? And so, seeing President Trump go to the summits, and what type of signaling can you use that either as small wins for this alliance or vice versa with ASEAN and the like-mindeds? Thank you.
You're welcome. And again, thank you for your service through the State Department and representing us. I think the Southeast Asian nations, ASEAN, is going to be a real dynamic playing field going forward. Very young, dynamic economies, populations, and caught between Chinese influence and Western influence. And they don't necessarily want to say we have to pick one side or the other because they're going to have relations on both sides. But underneath that, they do want to dictate their own futures. They do want to, their people do want to see what their futures look like. And I think it is a real opportunity for Western countries to work together. The United States, Japan already make, more investment in Southeast Asia than China does. How do we do that together in strategic ways? So when we talk about supply chain redundancy, we should be strategic. If we're going to, for critical minerals, maybe it is building up refining capacity in, a particular country to build up their economy. If we're talking about pharmaceuticals, maybe it is, U.S. companies with Japanese companies with Korean companies saying, hey, let's build up APIs in Vietnam or build up a semiconductor industry in Vietnam. And I think those are the dialogues that we should have together, right? Samsung makes huge investments in Vietnam already. Again, economics and trade bring countries closer together. That was part of the, I never saw TPP as just a purely trade deal. I saw it as a diplomatic deal, a mechanism to resolve disputes. And I think we have to work together to come up with 21st century mechanisms so we don't go to war, but we have ways to resolve through dialogue, discussion, some of the disputes that are bound to arise.
I see you mentioning Vietnam and thinking of this triangle, your U.S. Japan-Korea triangle. All of them have quite a bit of involvement in Vietnam. So foreign assistance or medical support or just any one of the subjects you've talked about, Vietnam could very well be one major arena for cooperation, couldn't it?
Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia as a large country, they're all ripe for the trilateral to work together to make investments. And in some places we're going to be in competition with, our companies will be in competition with one another, but in some places, I think you can find real cooperation. And you touched on, the Trump administration's been incredibly disruptive. It's been hard to try to, what is the Trump doctrine to foreign engagement? I won't get too political here. But the opportunity that's being created out of that disruption, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about the what comes next. So when we rebuild our diplomatic muscles, let's not build what we had before. Let's actually build something that's reflective of the 21st century. When we rebuild our aid and development tools, let's not build what we had before. Let's actually, this is going to be a difficult 3-4 years because there has been massive disruption. There has been a loss of human capital that we won't be able to restore immediately. I think that's why what all of you as young people are going to do is you're those future diplomats, you're those future dignitaries, elected officials. Let's think about what that looks like, what diplomacy development, global health security looks like in the 21st century. I'd love to say we're going to reform the United Nations. UN politics are probably much harder than congressional politics. But what are those alliances that, if you were building the United Nations, Japan would be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Germany would be a permanent. So we have to create mechanisms by which we can resolve disputes and identify common challenges for the 21st century. I don't think we have those at this particular moment in time.
I can't avoid this. John McCain, several others have talked about this notion of the League of Democracies. President Biden at one point had an interest. Do you have any thoughts on that?
President Biden, talked about that in a democracy summit very early on in his administration. We quite didn't get to where we wanted to go. We should take a crack at modernizing the institutions that we have. I'm not optimistic that you'll be able to do all of that. So then what are the institutions? And maybe it is a League of Democracies. Because I do think the alliances in the 21st century are going to be pure nations that share similar values. So you could think of the EU as representing democracy and free markets and freedom. The Asian nations, Korea, Japan, Australia. I would like to move India toward that category as well, and Canada, United States. Countries how do we create a new set of dialogues to resolve disputes? But you don't want to create a us against them, right? So you do want to have international organizations that would have a China, that would have a Russia, where you're not going to war, you're going to a place and having real conversation to say, what comes next for Ukraine?
Well, this is really fascinating. I just a little bit more. Do we have 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay, let's have 5 minutes. But in particular, 4 more questions, and maybe do you want to take them together and then you can answer? Yeah, and then answer them. Maybe just start right here. And apologies to everyone, especially students, please. Maybe, yeah, what, you had your hand up, that's 2. Somebody in the way back, are you a student? Student, okay. Anybody who's a student, I'd like 2 more people who are students. Right here. Student, right? Okay, 3. And, okay, 1 more right there, student. Yep, good. Okay. And so let's hear the questions, and then Congressman Bera will wrap it up. Please go ahead. A microphone there.
Thank you so much. Divya Gupta, and I'm here with my colleague, Mr. Ken Ketatani. We are from International Council of Environmental Economics and Development. We're a United Nations think tank. And so this conversation is very important to all of us, but definitely us as well. My question to you is, given that lack of support for growth in the global initiatives by the current U.S. administration, how challenging is it for you to progress without the needed support? And what steps can accelerate the growth, or if that is even possible?
Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you for this opportunity. I am Shinji Abe from Japanese Yomiuri Shimbun. I have a question about having a nuclear submarine for South Korea. What positive impact do you think this will have on cooperation between Japan, the US, and South Korea? And do you think Japan also should have a nuclear submarine?
Hello, my name is Minato Nooka. A student at SAIS, MIPP, originally from Japan. I would like to ask, what do you think should the energy cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, Korea should be? On one hand, the U.S. now has more energy dominance, exporting natural gas as well as oil, while we have this AI, electricity demand surge and electrification. So yeah, I'd like to ask about your.
And then our last question.
My name is Jiunan from American University students. I have a question about nuclear power submarine, so I don't need to ask about it. Thank you.
Nuclear power,
Yeah,
please.
of course. So the Trump administration, yeah, I'll answer some of the questions broadly, but they've left a huge void, right, by reducing, dismantling USAID, reducing our diplomatic presence around the world, reducing our commitments to food security, to global health security, the Global Fund, others. No one country is going to be able to fill that void, and obviously the foundational world won't be able to fill that void. It is going to cause real disruption and challenge around the world, and death. I mean, people will die because of that reduction. That's just the I was in Africa this summer, and in PEPFAR nations, kind of looking at things. So we have to think about what comes next. I don't know. I know Secretary Rubio. I know his history. I think he gets that we have to be present here, both in soft power but also humanitarian power. What it is doing is it is forcing other countries to step up to their capabilities. So Europe, Japan, Australia, others. So and the dialogue we're having, I'll just stick with Africa, is different, right? Because let's just use PEPFAR, which was, you know, the United States under George W. Bush going to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa. We created dependency there, and when you talk to the African leaders, they're like, well, we never expected this to be a forever program, but don't just end it abruptly. So what does transition look like? And I think that's the opportunity. I think that's what we have to spend our time talking about with our allies, with the nations of the world, to say, what is the what comes next, and how is it, you know, shared? How do we also build resiliency in, again, I'll just use the African continent, so that they're building their own capacity. So how do you go from dependency to resiliency to sustainability? The African nations want to do this as well. That means we have to change our policy, right? Because on food security, we've had a policy really, which was to subsidize our farmers. If we really want to stamp out hunger in Africa, we're going to take our best scientists, send them to Africa to teach them the most modern ways to farm, the most modern ways to manage water, and work with them to build up their own internal capabilities. There's no reason Africa can't feed itself. It's a resource-rich continent. It's just that wasn't how we developed this. We developed it to benefit American farmers and American flagships. So that's changing, and I think that's how I would answer that. On the nuclear question, which is a real interesting one. So if you look at polling in Korea, 70% of the public there thinks they should get their own nuclear deterrent capabilities. I don't think it's a great idea. I supported, you know, what came out of Camp David under the Biden administration, the Washington Declaration, the fact that we would maintain a more regular rotation of our nuclear submarines and others. I understand the rationale for why the public in Korea feels the way they do. I just think we should double our efforts to reassure our allies, Japan, Korea, that our nuclear commitments, our alliances, we are your nuclear umbrella. I also understand, you know, President Trump creates a level of uncertainty in how he talks about things. I think the danger is if, you know, you start to see Korean nuclear capabilities, then you will start to see Japanese nuclear capabilities, and you go in the wrong direction. It will create real concerns in China, and I think you start a nuclear arms race. I also understand, you know, going back to Ukraine, Ukraine gave up its nuclear capabilities for U.S. guarantees. I mean, President Clinton would say they weren't necessarily ironclad guarantees, but the rest of the world is seeing, you know, what happened in Russia and Ukraine. So I do think that is something that we should be, that I talk to my counterparts in Korea and Japan about when I'm there. We should be the nuclear umbrella. I don't want to see our children and grandchildren grow up with a renewed nuclear arms race. I think we're backsliding when we were making progress. That is one of the things about the what comes next after the conflict in Ukraine. And then the energy question. I do think we should be working very closely with Japan and Korea and others. So I don't think the future's LNG or carbon-based fuels necessarily. I'm a supporter of small modular nuclear energy. I think nuclear will be part of this. It's not commercially viable right now, and there's, you know, when I was in Korea, we've talked about this. You know, Hyundai would want to work with U.S. companies to try to figure this out. When I'm in India, they've said, you know, we ought to be working together on this. So we ought to be working together on finding those breakthrough solutions to make things like small modular safe, reliable, and commercially viable, so we can start to move towards cleaner fuels and cleaner energy. I don't see that as competition between the companies. Once you've made those discoveries, yes, there'll be competition because you'll have different companies, you know, competing against one another for contracts. But until you get there, our scientists should be working together to think about how are you going to fuel, you know, data centers and AI and all of that. We also don't spend enough time talking about water. which is going to be an increasingly precious commodity in this world. And you're seeing the lack of water, certainly in the global south, causing massive shifts in migrations and pressures. And you don't necessarily think about water as an immigration issue, but food and water insecurity are a large part of the reason why you see migration from the global south to the global north. And those are issues that we should work on together to try to solve, because again, I guess I would close with this. Maybe 20th century doctrine was, from a U.S. perspective, was a world that was separated and the U.S. isolated by two big oceans. 21st century, we're going to get closer and closer and smaller as a world. So we're going to have to solve challenges of humanity together. And they're going to be great challenges, things that we are not necessarily imagining today. AI should be used for global good to solve many of these issues, but often bad actors will use it to do bad things as well. So it's not a given what the next 75 years look like. I do think the United States, Korea, Japan, other democracies should really work together to create the next 75 years of peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed in the last 75 years. So that is my hope. You guys are the future. You're the next generation of those folks. Go out there and make it happen.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks everyone for coming as well.